But I think that when it comes to mainstream messaging, there's no doubt that Reform UK needs to tighten its communication, because there will be a decent chunk of the British public, they will see those comments and they will say that those comments are racist.
Hello and welcome to Spectator TV. I'm Natasha Feroze, and today I'm joined by journalist and writer Rakib Ehsan. And today we're going to be talking about some comments made by a Reform politician this week.
Drives me mad when I see adverts full of black people, full of Asian people, full of, people that basically are anything.
What's wrong with that, Sarah? What's wrong with that?
Rakib, this has been spoken about all week and it's caused a bit of a fierce debate. You wrote about it in The Telegraph. What did you make of the comments?
Well, I think the comments, put it like this, the wording wasn't the best. It was clumsy. The comments made by Sarah Pochin. It's received cross-party condemnation. To my understanding, the Health Secretary, Wes Streeting, Shadow Home Secretary, Chris Phelps, and Liberal Democrat MP Josh Babarinde, they've all labelled Sarah Pochin's comments as racist. Now, just to talk about these comments, these were comments which were made in an interview with Talk TV's Peter Cardwell, where Pochin said that it drove her mad to see how TV ads are full of black and Asian people, essentially people who are basically anything but white. So I can understand the accusations of racism. I think I'd be more inclined to say it was racism if Pochin had said that I don't really like seeing black and Asian people on TV at all. I don't think that was the point she was making. I think that Nigel Farage has criticised the comments, actually referred to them as wrong and ugly, but said that they were not intentionally racist. But I think that there's a point to be made here, Natasha, where I feel that the comments, we could talk about the wording being clumsy, we could say it was wrong, it was ugly, but I don't think that should shut down the debate when it comes to what kind of groups are underrepresented or overrepresented when it comes to TV advertising on our screens. I think that is an important discussion to have.
Yeah, and I suppose this falls into two different debates. There's the DEI issue and then there's free speech. So if we were to take the free speech situation first, do you think there has become a habit of Reform politicians specifically making quite incendiary remarks or just making kind of controversial remarks just to sort of reset this free speech issue? They just want to say something because they can say it.
Well, I think that the Overton window has shifted when it comes to discussing matters of race and identity. Now, we've seen there's been a great deal of outrage surrounding Sarah Pochin's comments. But for me, I think there is something to be said about what kind of groups are heavily represented in TV advertising. Why is that the case? And I thought what was really interesting was that when you look at the kind of groups which are usually included in advertising, there's a great study by Channel 4, which is not known to be a right-wing outlet, but put it that way, in the sort of mirror industry project, the agency Tapestry carried out quite interesting research. It looked at across all broadcasters the top 500 ads, and it found that we found that when looking at these ads, over half featured black people, even though black people represent only 4% of the national population, including when looking at the 2021 census, and there wasn't also an overrepresentation of South Asian people. Now, Sarah Pochin's comments, I think they could have been made a lot better, but I think that in this sort of era where we're seeing the emergence of the Black Lives Matter movement, I think there's almost been a sort of sense of overcompensating in certain sectors, especially the corporate world, in terms of being inclusive, especially in advertising.
Yes. And interestingly, I saw you wrote in your piece that just 1 in 1,000 adverts had pregnant women, and there was almost no pensioners in adverts. despite them making up
1 in 5 in the 1 in 5 in the general population considered a pensioner, and I find that remarkable.
And the most likely to watch TV as well.
Exactly, and I'd make the point that unless it's something like life insurance or funeral costs, then they don't get to look in really. And I think that comes to the point that now, of course, advertising, there's different incentives. Some people might argue that real forms of economic and cultural capital, they're in the cities, so that has to be reflected in TV advertising. It's not a surprise that certain groups are represented more than others. But I don't really buy into that. I think that what we're seeing here is more the fact that the advertising world is rooted in London. And to my understanding, it's a sector which is primarily staffed by sort of youthful cosmopolitans who may think that they're in touch with modern Britain, that they're looking to really create a sort of a more inclusive advertising sector. But I would actually argue it is they who are not necessarily in touch with modern Britain. I think the point you made about pregnant women featuring only 0.1% of the ads, I think there is that almost that sort of that modern progressive tendency to avoid anything which is remotely traditional when it comes to conceptions of womanhood, especially when it's rooted in biology. And I think that was quite a fascinating finding from the research.
One point I did see in the study, and Stephen Bush outlined this in his piece, was that actually perhaps for advertising agencies are trying to go for a catch-all approach demographically. There's a bar chart and we'll put that up on the screen, but there was a really high proportion of mixed race families in adverts. And the reason why is it's sort of like a 2-for-1 appeal, or even a 4-for-1 appeal. Do you think that carries some weight? Fundamentally, do companies really care about diversity, or are they just trying to sell their product?
I think that there's definitely that argument to be made that this is ultimately capitalism at work. This is how marketing works, and they've worked out the best way to maximize their profits, even though I do think the point of go woke, go broke, I think there's also an element of truth in that as well, which is why I think that you see across various industries and sectors, they're starting to roll back a bit. There's a bit of a rollback from much of the sort of DEI policies, you could say, which really escalated following the emergence of the Black Lives Matter movement. I think what's really interesting, though, is that some people make the argument that there's a great number of mixed race couples in ads, when actually, if you look at the data, now it is true that mixed race people are some of the fastest growing groups in the national population, but it is still the norm generally for people to marry within their own ethnic and racial group. That is generally the norm across most groups. So I think there is a sense that, okay, there is a possibility that people really know their audiences. This is the way they go about it. But there is a sense that there's an advertising world that's primarily rooted in London, which is not necessarily in touch with much of the national population, or they're looking to depict certain elements of the population, or indeed certain behaviours, which are considered to be, this is how it should be. This is how modern Britain should work. These are the best elements of modern Britain. And I think you can see that some people are pushing back against that.
And Rakib, there's another issue at play here, which surrounds sort of this idea of the demonization of white people. Often they're portrayed as the butt of the joke, or menacing, or like pervy young men, or evil characters. Is that fair as well?
There's a certain comfort in terms of depicting certain groups or members of a certain group in particular situations. Now the question is, are there many people working in the advertising world, if they wanted to show a particular situation of sexual harassment on the tube, would they be comfortable if the male doing it to a female, if the male was white and the female was black, they'd probably be more comfortable with that. Now, if the races were reversed in that situation, I'm not sure they would be so comfortable with that. And I think that was mainly the arguments when we had Adolescence, which, by the way, overall I thought was a very good series. I think the acting was brilliant. I think Owen Cooper and Stephen Graham, they deserve all the awards and the plaudits. But it was ultimately, much of this programme was motivated by a killing in London, which involved 2 black people in terms of the perpetrator and the victim. So I think that, as well as talking about representation, are certain groups overrepresented, are certain groups underrepresented, I think it's about how certain members of groups are depicted And is the advertising world more comfortable with depicting members of a particular group in a negative way compared to other groups? I think there's a point to be made there as well.
Just anecdotally, Rakib, I've noticed that the conversations I have about this in my circle in journalism, in the industry, in politics, are very different to the conversations that happen amongst family and friends of all races. Do you think that there is, within corporations, within journalism, the discourse, there's a lot of creeping around, and then there's a lot of people that just say really bolshy comments, and there's no sort of quite calm middle ground? You know, perhaps you could shed light on how you talk to your friends and family about different races being in advertising. Is it quite so controversial?
I don't think it's necessarily controversial to make the point that if you feel that there's certain groups who are depicted a certain way, if members of certain groups are depicted more negatively in ads, if certain groups just feature more generally in advertising, I think that the debate in itself, and I make this point that Pochin's comments, they were certainly not to my liking. Well, I think there's just a discussion to be made, because people talk a great deal about the importance of representation in various aspects of British life, in politics, media, business, and all the rest of it. So I don't see that why we shouldn't talk about representation when it comes to TV advertising. I think that's fair game.
And lastly, Rakib, there was a YouGov poll which suggested almost one of the few areas in which the Reform Party have not advanced is that some members of the public feel as if they have become more racist than what they thought of them since 2024. What do you think about the Reform Party as it grows now, and as it takes on some quite flavourful characters, and how many of them don't understand the concept of towing a party line, or what it would be like to be kicked out of a party, or what it's like for other MPs, their fellow MPs, that have to go on the airwaves and defend some comments they make? You know, it's a really difficult thing to run. Do you think that the Reform Party can outlast this sort of nature?
Well, I think that so Sarah Pochin made these comments about sort of racial representation in TV advertising on Talk TV. Now, the reality is that different platforms, the nature of their bases are different. But I think that when it comes to mainstream messaging, there's no doubt that Reform UK needs to tighten its communication, because there will be a decent chunk of the British public, they will see those comments and they will say that those comments are racist. Even I would say that, listen, I'm not shrinking violet, but the wording was very bad. There's no two ways about it. I think just to make just a very quick point, and then I'll just go back to Reform UK's communication more generally. With the ads, it's very interesting that in that particular research, I think only 4% of ads featured disabled people. Now, around a quarter of the country report having a disability. And I think that in a way, our cultural obsessions with race have meant that disability has almost become the forgotten, protected characteristic. It's not seen as very fashionable to even promote disability interests, which I think that it is a crying shame, considering the fact that a quarter of people report having a disability. And I think that comes to the point that there's so many good points actually to make about the kind of groups which are underrepresented in TV advertising. Why is that the case? And I think that really shows that communication is important. Now, what certain Reform UK politicians may well get away with saying on GB News, Talk TV, and other channels, when it comes to being in the mainstream media sphere, they may not go down as well. It might go down quite badly. And I think that the risk that for Reform UK, and there's no doubt that in the polling, that they are miles ahead of everyone else. That's been the case when it comes to polling, and that's been that's consistent trend now. But the worry is that there's always a sense that could there be this kind of stop reform, tactical voting among more progressive-minded voters, and I think that's a real risk for reform. And it's the fact that there's a decent chunk of the British population, they want reform to do well, but I actually think they're outnumbered by people who don't really want reform. to do very well. And if that opposition to reform is so strong, then that tactical voting, that progressive tactical voting against reform, if that happens across much of the country, that would be a very serious problem for them. If they do, because ultimately what they want a parliamentary majority. That would be a major obstacle if that was to take place.
Rakib Ehsan, thank you for joining us.